Welcome, everybody. This is Kat, although I recognize all the names, and so you would know who I am. But this is Kat White, President of the Board of Trustees, and this is our annual presentation on the budget proposal for the 2021 congregation year. And thank you all for tuning in remotely. Hope you all have a good cup of coffee and or you're sitting out where you can enjoy the lovely day. And we thank you for being here for this. Annually, the board has to create a budget for the upcoming year. And every year it's a challenge. Don't get me wrong on that. Every year this is a challenge. And then you add in everything that is going on. And this year was even more challenging than most. And so this year, we went through, a lot of deliberation, and, we had to, look at some things and speculate. And so probably even more than most years. This year, we are really, once again, taking a leap of faith in our budget. And so without going into too much detail, I'm going to let you know that Carol's going to be talking about sort of the procedures for Zoom, and Shane is then going to be delivering the budget presentation. Wayne is our host, and so he's going to be sort of controlling things in the background, and Carol will be the one who reads questions at the end. So I'm going to turn this over to Carol and put myself on mute.
Okay, we're all figuring out Zoom at different levels in this time. So just a few pieces of information. Everyone is muted. When we were playing with this yesterday, we found that on a screen that if you turn off side-by-side mode, you'll get a bigger screen of the actual presentation. So on view options at the very top of my screen, there's an option that says side-by-side mode. And if that is checked off, you'll get the full screen of the presentation itself. If you want to ask a question, which we encourage people to do, use the Q&A icon on the meeting toolbar and type in your question and hit send, and I will present them to Shane at the end of each screen and or throughout the presentation. So I think that's what I have. Did I miss anything, Shane?
No, I don't think so. I think that's everything we wanted to send out. I think there was a raise hand function. I don't know if you were going to use that, Carol, or not, for folks that couldn't figure out the Q&A.
We're going to try not to use the raise hand function just because it's another thing to kind of try and keep eyes on. But if that's the only way you can get our attention, go ahead and do it. We're not going to like ban you from the thing. But the preference is Q&A because that's where I'll be monitoring the most closely.
All right, ready to go?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then I'm going to jump into the numbers. First, looking at what this year we're in, and then looking at the budget that we've put together for the subsequent year. So just by way of introduction, Shane Millett, I'm the treasurer for the church. This, as Kat has said, this is a little bit more unusual a year than other years. This is a pandemic environment and it's created a certain amount of uncertainty. Given that, we have done our best to try to estimate, usually pretty conservatively, revenues and expenses for the organization. So I'll get into some detail on that as we proceed through the slides. Before I start, I really want to thank Finance Committee, Leadership Committee, and the board. It went through those three groups, and there were a number of other parties too that helped with the budget itself. So very much a group effort amongst folks that are in leadership and outside of leadership to put together the budget for the subsequent year. You'll notice as we go through and we get to the budget itself that there are some cuts, there are some allowances, that take into account this current economic uncertainty. And with that said, I'm going to jump into these numbers right here that you see on the slide in front of you. So this is our current year. This column right here is where I project we're going to end the year. Here's our budget that was passed by the congregation in the prior year. And I'm just going to highlight certain numbers to give you a sense of where I think we're going to end the year this year. So I think we're going to end the year with a deficit of $65,000. We budgeted a deficit of $88,000. So a little bit better than the deficit that was budgeted for the prior year, but still a deficit nonetheless. If you look at the revenue side, we've got $570,000 compared to $599,000. So why did we fall short? About $30,000 in revenues. It's really in two areas primarily. One is in rentals. So with the building closure, we're anticipating losing some rental income. And then in non-pledged income, we also are going to lose some funds there. The big reason being the auction. We are changing the auction to an online version of the auction, and we expect less income as a result. I'm going to take this opportunity to make a pitch for everybody to participate as best they can to that virtual auction, which is coming up in May. But just to be prudent, we're going to anticipate fewer revenues associated with the auction because it'll be our first time conducting a virtual or online auction. Just a few things to say about the pledged income. You can see it's pretty close to budget, even though when we look at April through to the end of June, we are estimating that we're going to get fewer pledge payments in that period of time just because of this economic environment that we're in. But when we did set the budget last year for pledges, the pledge campaign wasn't finished yet, and we did get some pledges after the fact. So this budgeted pledge number that we set for prior year, it was lower than what the actual pledges were. So for 2019-20, total pledges turned out to be 469,000 approximately. And of that 469,000, we're estimating we're going to get 444,000 of it. So as I said from the outset, we're trying our best to estimate where we'll finish the year with pledge income, taking into account that some folks might not be in a position to pay their pledges as originally committed because of this uncertain environment. But still, even if they don't, we're anticipating we'll come pretty close to budget anyways. Now on the expense side, with personnel, we're under budget in that area, primarily because we had a couple of staff that started later in the year. We had somebody on an extended medical leave, and we also had a position that went down to half-time. In the program area, we're a little bit under because we're not going to be spending quite so much on service musicians or worship service honorariums, also a result of having the building closed down. And then also stewardship didn't quite spend as much, didn't really need to spend as much this year running their campaign. So that's what accounts for that difference there. And then in administration, we're also under budget in that area. The big reason being every year we have to get an audit or a review. What we're doing is combining our short year as an organization from February until June 30th, 2019 to our first full year as a reunified organization. And we're able to do one audit for that combined period. And by doing one audit that covers 2 periods, we end up saving some money there with that audit or review that we need to get. And then in building and grounds, we went over a little bit. Primarily, it was because of some boiler and water issues, and I can get into more details about that if there are questions outside of this presentation. But we did have building and grounds issues that ran over budgets for our 19-20 year. And then down at the bottom, we have our capital expenditures. And you may recall from last year's budget, we authorized the purchase of a new dishwasher and carpet. Those were both installed and actually came in less than expected. But then we also had doors. So when on the first use side, we authorized the purchase and renovation of doors at the side to create better security. The spending for that actually occurred in this year. So that's why we're a little bit over in that area. So Carol, before I proceed to the next few slides, are there any questions on anything I've said so far?
Not so far.
Okay. So this next slide kind of summarizes everything that I just said. And this, of course, this budget presentation will be available to anybody who wants to see it. And not only that, we're recording the budget presentation. So if you wanted to watch this or send it to someone who's unable to watch it, they'll get those notes, those things that I'm saying that are recorded here in abbreviated form. So these comments here, just in summary on the year that's just about to end. To recap, revenues and expenses is affected by the pandemic, no doubt, unclear to what degree, and the loss at the end of 1920, it's there, but it's $20,000 less than anticipated. Also worth noting is we have cash on hand at this point in time anyways of 3.6 months of operational expenses. So the organization spends about $53,000 a month to run the two buildings, and we have cash on hand somewhere a little bit above $200,000. So that's a good position to be in for us. Typically, the recommendation is 3 to 6 months of cash on hand is a good place to be.
Shane, can I interrupt real quickly? Apparently at the top of the screen, it says June 30th, 2019. Is that?
Oh, that should be 20.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Good clarification.
Two questions came up at the same time, so yeah.
Right, that should be June 30th, 2020, not 2019. All right, and if there are no other questions, I'm going to proceed to the next slide.
No other questions.
All right, so here's the budget that we've worked on for the 2021 year. And this one I'm going to go through in some detail. I would ask you to hold your questions until I can get through it completely, and then I have a feeling many of your questions will get answered as I go through it. So let me start first by talking about the pledges. So pledge donations at $420,000. So we had a pledge campaign which just concluded. We're still working on gathering some pledge information. We had some folks who decided they wanted to defer and make a decision about what to pledge later on in the year, and we gave them that option. We set a goal of 500,000, and we got our best guess here with a discount is that 420,129. So that's approximately $30,000 less than the prior year. So it's also worth noting that when we were initially looking at reunification, we were estimating pledges somewhere around $500,000 or more than $500,000, so lower than expected. Now, how much of this is due to the pandemic and the uncertain environment we're in, or how much of it is due to other reasons, we just don't know. But that's the number we're going to go with. We figure it's a good conservative estimate for the subsequent year, and we wanted to use that number as the driver for the rest of the budget. So while we work on the rest of the budget, it's important to note that that pledge donation number is the most important number. So this budget overall, I just want to touch on overall what this budget reflects. It is a $40,000 reduction in personnel costs compared to the prior year budget. This budget assumes ownership of both buildings for the entire year. So that may in effect not be true for the entire year next year, but the assumption is with the revenues and the expenses in this budget that we'll have both buildings for the entire year. This budget also includes a UUA recommended search budget of $10,000. So that's something that came from the UUA itself and we wanted to include in this budget. And then regarding utilization of restricted funds, we restricted the use of those restricted funds to 5% of the investments. It includes a draw from the Parsons Fund. It includes a draw from the Operating Endowment Income Fund. And it also includes a drawdown of the Killam Fund to support the DRE position. This budget also reflects an overall $52,000 reduction in budgeted operational expenses compared to the prior year. And it also comes with a Finance Committee recommended appraisal system, or appraisal format, I should say. So what Finance Committee wanted to do, and the board certainly agreed with it, is to set up some benchmarks as we proceed through the subsequent year and make sure that we're meeting those benchmarks. And if we're not, then the Finance Committee would like to recommend some additional reductions in costs. So while we're looking at this budget and there's a certain amount of estimates that go into it, we're making our best guesses here. We realize going into next year that in this uncertain economic environment that things might end up differently. And if that's the case, then we definitely want to react in real time to whatever might be on the horizon for us, whether it be maybe pledge donations that don't come in as expected or other expenses that we weren't anticipating. Also in the budget process, at the Finance Committee leadership as well as at the board level, we wanted to, and discussed it many times, what would be involved in getting to a 3-year balanced budget and a sustainable use of restricted funds. I'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later, but I did want to let everybody know that there has been past efforts to use 3-year projections in order to get ourselves to a sustainable position when it comes to budgeting. I think there's a renewed momentum there at the leadership level, at the board level, and I think we're going to see a commitment not only from finance but also from leadership within the church itself to come up with a very credible 3-year plan that's going to get us to a place that's more of a balanced budget and a limited reliance on the restricted funds to support the operations of the church. Not included in this budget and not included in the financial statements that I was looking at earlier is a $78,000 CARES Act forgivable loan. So some of you might be familiar with this opportunity that was laid out through federal legislation, the CARES Act, but organizations, small businesses, which included churches and nonprofits, were eligible to apply for federal funds in the form of a forgivable loan that would help them if they were adversely affected by the pandemic. Almost certainly we were. We saw that reflected in our rental income most directly. And to some degree, although we know not how much, to some degree, I believe it's also affected what's happened with pledge payments. So we went ahead and applied for and received a confirmation of those funds coming, and there'll be about $78,000 that'll help us with cash flow in the subsequent months. So Carol, at this point, does anybody have any questions?
I have 2 questions now. So the first one is, does the budget include full fair share for the UUA?
It does.
Okay, that was quick. And the second one is regarding the benchmarking and the planning. So what are some examples of benchmarks?
So an example would be, you can see we've set a net from operations of $50,000. One of the things the Finance Committee will be looking at for sure is where are we at with regard to this deficit as we proceed through the year. If we get to December, for example, and we've already hit the $50,000 deficit mark or greater, then at that point we will be looking at ways to do additional cuts. And there will be other details too to be fleshed out in the Finance Committee. But in principle, the idea is let's see how closely or how much we vary from the budget itself. We're basically going to take this budget, we're going to break it down probably into pieces quarterly and what we can reasonably expect as we proceed through the year. And then we'll take a look and evaluate on a quarterly basis where we end up. And if we are significantly if we significantly vary from the budget as it's outlined, then we're going to make some recommendations appropriately. So I don't know if that gives you enough detail on what we're thinking from a benchmark perspective, but it does give the Finance Committee a little bit more of an active role in with communicating to the board itself, an active role in managing what's going on with the budget itself.
Okay, one more question just came in. What are the administrative costs if not for personnel?
So administrative costs are, let me see if I can get a list up and I can name a few of those. They are not for personnel, they are for things like the review or the audit. Hold on a second. So computer supplies, computer expenses, office supplies, copier expenses, other admin expenses, postage, the county tax assessment, any bank fees we might incur, payroll service fees. So there are some examples. Any other questions, Carol?
Nope.
Okay. So as before, I put the comments here summarized so that if someone just wanted to read through it, they could certainly read through the slides and see what it was I was talking about here. I guess one point here that I may not have emphasized through my presentation of the budget, but I do want to emphasize here is the leadership of the congregation is to develop a 3-year balanced budget and a sustainable use of restricted funds. So I know when the Finance Committee first met, the goal was to really start this process this year. Given our current environment, we wanted to make an allowance for what is perhaps a once-a-century type of economic arrangement here. But I wanted to let everybody know that this is certainly on finance's mind, this idea of basically developing a budget that would allow us to live within and to and that would acknowledge if we're stuck at this $420,000 level for pledges that we need to have a budget that reflects that particular number. Just not to put too fine a point on it, but if we have pledge numbers, pledge income level at $420,000 going forward, if that's the new normal for us, then that certainly would require us to take a hard look at the budget and make revisions accordingly. So the last 2 slides I have here are deal with the investments themselves.
Okay, then I have 2 questions I want to ask you before you move to those.
Okay.
Okay, does the pandemic affect any plans for the Lancashire building?
So the answer to that is potentially. We are listening to what the Facilities Task Force and the strategic planning has to say about both. If we end up putting the Lancashire building on the market at some point in the near future, we might get advice from a realtor that recommends delaying that approach. So the idea there is potentially. I know we've, just like with our own, or with the 21600 building, we've seen a reduction in rental income associated with the Lancashire building. So the pandemic is affecting what's going on with that building as well.
Okay, the questions are popping up now. So are there any restrictions on the CARES loan, and where is the 10K for search reflected? So that's actually two questions.
So the CARES loan, it's called the Paycheck Protection Program loan, and it's to be used primarily for payroll. Fortunately for us, 4/6 of our, or 2/3 of our expenses are payroll related. So I don't think we'll have a problem spending that and getting the entire amount forgiven. You can use up to 25% of those, of that loan on utilities as well. So we have significant utilities between the two buildings. When the money goes in the bank, which should happen sometime this week, then we have 8 weeks of payroll and utility expenses will be applied for the forgiveness of the loan. I don't see a problem getting the entire loan forgiven, given the finances of the church. In effect, this loan becomes a $78,000 grant to the church itself, which is pretty helpful to us from a cash flow perspective. And then remind me again the second question, Carol.
Sorry, I lost that one. And where is the search budget in the, where is search reflected in the budget?
Oh, right. So search is in the, I believe it's in program, in that program section. I'm just going to double check that, but I believe that's where it is. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next question is, what portion of our expenses is related to the Lancashire building? Also the revenues.
So I can tell you the net effect. Probably a better way to answer that question is to say we do get some rental income, but we have expenses that are spread out throughout all 4 expense categories. I think it's best summarized to say that with the ownership of the building, we lose approximately $2,000 a month on the ownership of that building. So the revenues associated with the building matched up against the expenses of the building is approximately $2,000 a month more in expenses than revenues. Hopefully that answers that question.
What are the reductions in personnel costs?
So they're primarily in 3 areas. One is we have a full-time position is a part-time position, so that's different compared to the prior year. Pay for RE teachers we're eliminating in this budget. We've also reduced professional expenses for the staff across the board. So it's primarily in those 3 areas.
Okay. What is the percentage or numbers of members who have not yet pledged?
So I was just told this earlier today. Let me see. So the folks who have not pledged, there's 14 of them, 14 who have pledged last year and have decided that they cannot pledge at this time, but wanted to wait until later on in the year to discuss what their pledge is going to be. And the total pledge number, the total that they pledged in 1920 was $13,600 approximately.
Since I was in that meeting, I know that's talking about the people who deferred their pledges, but this question is also, how many people are we still waiting to get a pledge from?
How many outstanding that have not pledged yet at all? So that number, I think at this point is pretty small. Do you recall, Carol, what it is?
I'm thinking it's a dozen, 15, 20. Yeah, there's a couple meaningful, like big number ones, but mostly
Yeah,
it's,
I think
we're actually in really good shape on contacting stewardship.
right. And I remember, so the takeaway from this morning's meeting, stewardship meeting, was we were at a pretty good point in terms of response rate. We had 14 people who deferred. We had maybe a dozen or so, and I can't remember the exact number, but a relatively small number of folks who were waiting for a response. But we'd received a commitment, one way or the other, from most of the congregation, most of the members and friends who had pledged in the prior year, or new members who were pledging for the first time this year. The response rate was pretty good, especially considering the environment that we were working in this year, where it was, it was a virtual stewardship campaign. We did get a good response.
Okay. Can you explain the spend down of cash on hand line further?
Sure. So spend down of cash on hand, this 127.50 is this 50,000 here plus this 70,750 up above. So what we're saying in this budget is we have enough cash on hand presently that we can absorb this or spend down basically our cash on hand. And in this budget, we would not need to go to the investments themselves in order to liquidate any of those investments at this time. So I know on finance and amongst other folks, there was generally there was not a strong desire to do any spending or liquidate any of the investments at this time because we are in this down market environment. We wanted to let those investments sit without drawing down from them. But we're fortunate that we're in a cash position, and this, and again, once again, the PPP loan money comes into play here that would allow us to spend down our cash on hand rather than go to the investments themselves.
Okay. I have a couple pledge unit questions. Do we know how many pledge units we have, what our average pledge is, and also how many members increase their pledge? So I don't know if you have those, Shane, or if we should put Don to work calculating them and replying later.
Can we make a note of that question and we'll put that out in an e-blast?
Yeah.
We can send that out because I don't have that information at my fingertips right now, but we just concluded the stewardship campaign and we'll send out some information that will give exactly that information.
Okay, another question. What will the effect of eliminating pay for RE teachers be on the program?
Well, that's going to be maybe an Alan, Georgia type question. That's something we're going to have to make work. I know this past year, and I know this just because of the different things I've done as treasurer, but I know there were a couple of folks who refused to be paid to begin with. So, and we did have at one time on the First U side an all-volunteer teacher arrangement. So essentially, we'll be going back to that type of arrangement. Exactly what the impacts are on the program itself, I guess, is hard for me to predict. But we did feel like that was something we could accommodate and make work.
Okay. I think then we have answered all the questions that are here outside of the stewardship ones that'll come out separately.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the last two slides, which deal with investments primarily. So investments and deficits plus the use of restricted funds. I think I'm going to just walk you through a little bit of what this is telling us, and then give you my takeaway from this particular slide. But basically, the red bars represent either a spend down of cash or investments over time. So in the first few years, 2015 to 2018, of course, this is just First U. And then in 2019, of course, we got reunified. We saw an uptick in our investments. but also we saw an uptick in some of the spending that we're doing as well. Now, some of this spending is the use of restricted funds per their purpose, but some of it is also a deficit that's generated on the financial statements. So when we go to this question of sustainability and where we want to be going forward, the takeaway that I would draw from this particular slide is, as much as possible, we want to stay close to this blue line. We really don't want to get above it too many times. And if we go underneath a couple of times, that's good. But basically, what we're trying to do is have a sustainable spend down of cash or investments over time. We will always be spending down some of the investments because we're not going to just accumulate investments for the sake of accumulating investments. We also want to be able to spend from those investments to further the mission of the church itself. But what's important to take away here is you can see over the last few years that we've been doing some significant draws. And even with the uptick in overall investments, we've also are drawing some significant dollars here. Some of it is coming from cash that we have on hand, and some of it is from investments themselves. But I think it's important just to see what it is we're facing here as we proceed through the next couple of years. And then on the last slide, I've got basically a summary, which I thought did a pretty good job of summarizing what we have going on with investments. So our total investments as of the end of March are about 1.4 million. Roughly half, a little more than half of them are unrestricted. On the First Use side, some years ago, we had a conversation about how much should we have in unrestricted investments. And there was the thinking that we would look at this as our piggy bank or our rainy day fund, and what's the right amount of money to have in unrestricted investments. And what we determined at that time is that 1 year's worth of operational expenses was about right. So sitting in investments, a little bit more than half, we have a little bit more than a year's worth of unrestricted expenses sitting there. It puts us in somewhat of a favorable position. You might look at this slide and you might look at the previous slide and say, well, they appear to somewhat contradict each other. And what I would say is we are in a position at present to ride out this uncertainty for a short period of time, but we can't do so indefinitely. What we have in the way of this budget is a good budget for this subsequent year. It has a lot of conservative estimates in it, but it is not a sustainable budget for the year after that or the year after that. So if we do have pledge numbers that are similar next year or the year after that, then we'll be looking at a very different kind of budget. But for this subsequent year, we believe through finance, through LC, and through the board, we believe we've come up with a good workable budget that does reasonable cuts, but also takes into account what kind of an unusual environment we're in presently. So with that, I'm going to conclude my part here and allow Kat to come in and say a few words, but I wanted to go back to you, Carol, and see if there are any more questions, comments, any subsequent information that might be asked for.
There is not right now.
All right, then. I guess I've done my job. Kat, at this time, I'll let you come in and close it out, but I just want to, again, thank everybody, in particular Wayne and Carol and Kat, for helping to put together this webinar. I've not done one of these before, so I think it worked pretty well.
Good job, Shane.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Carol. Shane, I appreciate, as always, your level-headed, clear presentation of a lot of financial information that can be mind-numbing for those of us who are not financial people by nature or by profession. So thank you, as always, for that presentation. And so I wanted to wait. I noticed we have 2 Q&As that just popped in. So before I say the final word, Carol, could you take a peek and see if there's something we need?
The first one is great job, Shane. And then the second one is how much do we actually save by eliminating teachers?
So the teachers was just under $15,000. So we budgeted, last year we budgeted, I think it was 14,700, something like that, for teachers' pay. For the subsequent year, that's not included in this budget.
Okay. And there's still a 1. Is that the great job?
Yeah, I did that.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so thank you everybody for being here. We're going to create an FAQ document that we will post and make available. We recorded this meeting and we'll be posting this to our YouTube channel and then posting a link to it on Facebook and on the website, and sending out the link in, excuse me, in the e-blast probably for the rest of the month of May, especially as we head toward the annual meeting. We want to make sure that we have people prepared for the annual meeting. We want everybody in the congregation to be well informed before we get to the annual meeting, and we want to provide all the resources for that. Remember that participating in the annual meeting and making your voice heard are important parts of membership in our congregation. And to that end, we thank you all for being here today, and we wish you well. Take care, stay healthy, get outside and enjoy this lovely day while we have one, and we look forward to seeing you online in the near future, and we look forward to the day when we will see you all in person. Thank you, everybody, for being here.